Today, we're going to give you the truth about threshold heart rate. My name is Shona Hendricks and I'm from CoachPerry.com. And a while ago, we did a video on maximum heart rate, what it is, whether it's worthwhile using in your training and how to use it in your training. And we got a lot of questions from there about threshold heart rate. And so this video is all about threshold heart rate, what it is, how to test it, how to practically use it in your training. And so with that, I'm going to hand over to Dev, and he is going to explain exactly what threshold heart rate is.
So what is threshold heart rate? Threshold, by definition, is really a sustained effort that you can sustain. The theory behind it is anything up to sort of an hour's worth of intensity. So it is the highest intensity you can sustain for an extended period of time. That is the gist of what threshold heart rate is.
Now that we know what threshold heart rate is exactly, let's talk a little bit why we at Coach Perry prefer to use the threshold heart rates as opposed to maximum heart rate when we are prescribing in our training plans. Essentially, when we're using maximum heart rates as an idea, there's so many different variances or unreliabilities with the ways that you work maximum heart rate out. If you're interested in diving into that, you can go and check out our other video on maximum heart rate. But essentially, whether you're using the age-related formula to get to your maximum heart rate, or if you're doing a test in a laboratory, there's always going to be small nuances that are not going to give you a true maximum heart rate, which means if you don't have a true maximum heart rate, when you're then putting that into your prescription, you're not going to get true variables. When you're using threshold heart rate, as Dev has described, it's about doing a sustained hard effort for an extended period of time. That is a bit more indicative of how we like to train in certain periods. And so using our threshold heart rate is a little bit more relative and specific to you as the individual.
So now that we know what threshold heart rate is, we know why we prefer it over using maximum heart rate, we need to now determine how do we go about testing to get your specific threshold heart rate. Behind me, I've put together a graph to just explain a little bit better how we're going to go about doing this. Ideally, what we want to be doing is running a time trial effort. So a time trial effort being an all-out effort. We generally look for about 30 to 40 minutes, gives us a good indication of what your threshold heart rate would be. The reason being is we need a little bit of time, and as you can see here, for your heart rate to climb and get up to a steady state effort, and then your heart rate will tend to plateau over a period of time. And that 30 to 40 minutes is where we found to get a really good plateau and for it to sustain as a high effort intensity and for your heart rate to stay quite stable. Anything longer than an hour, we generally will then start to see a little bit of a drop off in heart rate. So again, that's going to affect those numbers. And as I mentioned, anything too short is actually not going to get to that plateau and a sustained effort, or rather a steady state type effort. So I've just plotted here heart rate versus time, and as you can see, as we would start the run, naturally your heart rate would climb. As I suggested, it drops off or plateaus off a little bit, and for that period of that 30 to 40 minutes, we will then use your average heart rate, and we can be as a good estimation that that average heart rate is going to be very close to what your threshold is. Using that heart rate, we would then determine our different zones based on percentage calculations of that threshold heart rate. One thing when we talk about testing, and I talk about steady state, especially when we are trying to get a good steady state heart rate and a consistent heart rate, the accuracy of that measurement is what is absolutely vital. You may have heard us in the past speaking the wrist-based units versus wearing a chest strap. The preferred method and the more accurate method is to use a chest belt or a chest-based heart rate monitor. That is going to be a lot more accurate for a stable reading versus using the elliptical sensor on the back of your watch itself, which we tend to find a fair amount of fluctuation as well as some inconsistencies in terms of the difference of heart rate from an accuracy point of view. So now we've determined our threshold heart rate, we know what it is, but what does that mean? How do we actually practically implement it into our training going forward? Again, new graph. We're going to now talk, we've changed it to heart rate versus intensity. So the black line here will be our heart rate and how it increases over time as the intensity increases. And then just in colors here, I've just given a little bit of a breakdown from what we refer to as our zone 2 heart rate, or our easy type of work, and then we will touch on as well talking a little bit of higher intensity work. Now, the zone 2 heart rate, generally based on that threshold value that we've determined, we look at about 80%, sometimes touching on about 85% as your upper limit of your zone 2 heart rate. That is where all of your easy runs and your long runs get done from a heart rate point of view. So again, 80 to 85% of threshold as your upper limit of zone 2. Keep in mind, when I talk about sort of that 80 or 85% of threshold and we talk about those intensities, the reason we talk about heart rate zones and it being a slightly wider distribution of heart rate is from an energy expenditure point of view. If I have to look at this graph and we say this line would be my upper limit of zone 2, whether I'm working at the upper limit or the lower limit of my zone 2 heart rate for my easy runs, physiologically you are getting the exact same benefit whether you are working at the lower end or the upper end of that zone. However, by working at the higher end, it is more taxing on your body, so the eccentric load that you are putting into your legs on a run at the upper limit is going to be a little bit higher than what it would at the lower limit, which means more cost on the body. Also then obviously means it takes longer for recovery time and how quick we can be ready and fresh to take on the next training session. So there is going to be that aspect we need to keep in mind and why we use the zone. And again, as I said, whether you are working at the bottom or the upper end of that zone, same physiological benefit. Upper zone just means there's more energy expenditure and it's more taxing on the system. As usual, we always driving home that zone 2, that lower intensity. That's what makes up the bulk of our training week or our training volume. We talk about an 80-20 ratio, so 80% of our training volume for novice runners and amateur runners. We can actually push that almost up to 90% of our volume being that zone 2 or lower. That 10% up to 20% of the higher intensity is now where we start to talk into the zone 4s and up towards the zone 5 heart rate. So the higher intensity heart rate. Where does that come in? That is in anything we do that refers to sort of interval work, whether we're doing hill repeat work, track sessions, longer intervals, shorter intervals. That is our higher intensity, but that makes up a very small portion of what we do in our weekly volume. There is obviously going to be certain times where we are doing different kind of intensity work, but it really is about the accumulated minutes that you spend at this time. It's not necessarily, and I don't mean that in the case of that you should go out for a 30 or 40 or 50 minute run at zone 4 or zone 5. But if you are doing, I'm going to use hill repeats for an example, and doing 2-minute hill repeats and you're doing 6 of those intervals with a break between, those are the accumulated minutes I'm referring to that make up this higher intensity zone. One thing just to keep in mind is when we are talking shorter intervals, so I'm talking 100s, 200s, even up to 1-minute hill repeats as well, there is a slight lag in heart rate response. And that heart rate response lag can take up to a minute. So if you are doing the very short intervals and you want to work according to heart rate alone, you are going to struggle to hit that zone 4 or zone 5 heart rate in the first couple of intervals because your heart rate's still trying to catch up to the effort that you are actually putting in. The problem with that, we look down at our watch, we realize, wow, we're nowhere near the heart rate I want to be at, so we start to work even harder, and then we start working completely off the scale from an effort level, but our heart rate's still trying to play catch up. So in those cases, shorter intervals, short hill repeats, I would then recommend working according to rate of perceived exertion or actual paces if you know what paces have been prescribed for you. If you found value in this video and what we've discussed today, hit the like button. Make sure you do subscribe and feel free to click on the link on screen now if you are interested in learning more about the maximum heart rate. We have put a video together for that as well.